What is the big overarching theme of the Pittsburgh Steelers draft? Well, it was to get more physical and to start being the bullies again. We're going to talk more about that, an analysis of this draft class compared to others, as well as a look at the Steelers offensive line right here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're joined today by Alan Saunders of Pittsburgh Sports Now and SteelersNow.com. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting app, but especially on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content, like all of the bonus content we had over this past weekend covering the draft. We thank you for making us your first listen every day because we're your team every day here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. Today, I said we're joined by Alan Saunders, man of SteelersNow.com. Alan, we both kind of talked about, we're just talking about off camera about how we both kind of took a few extra hours to sleep on Sunday just to kind of catch our breath. But now that we have caught our breath, I think looking back at this draft class, there's a lot to be excited about talent-wise. Like there's a lot to be excited about. But one thing that I connect with pretty much all of the top picks, from Broderick Jones to Joey Porter Jr. to Keeanu Benton to Darnell Washington, physicality, strength, bullying opponents. That was absolutely the theme of their top four picks in the top 93 spots in the NFL draft class. If that was their goal, do you think that they got as good of a haul as they could get to accomplish that this year?
Absolutely. I think when you look at this class, to me, this class is the best, like the ultimate refinement of what I consider Mike Tomlin's draft strategy to be. Mike Tomlin has always wanted athletes, right? And he has always focused more on athletic traits than things like technique. If you remember, he was on that podcast with Ryan Clark last offseason. He was talking about how, like, look, I don't evaluate people on things that their coach should be teaching them or not teaching them. That's my job to coach them. I'll deal with that. I just want to evaluate the athletes. And I think they did the best job they've ever done of not just focusing on top athletes and athletic tendencies, but then marrying that to draft value. Like, I mean, you look at a guy like Terrell Edmunds, okay? Like one of the most phenomenal athletes that the Steelers have had in the last decade. The man has less body fat on his body than I have from like here up on my right wrist, okay? Like just one of the greatest athletes they've ever drafted. But it was a bad draft pick because he wasn't right for the position. The position doesn't have that much value to begin with. But they still got all these incredible athletes with these great athletic traits that seem to be physically dominant, but then also did it in a draft value way that makes the most sense that they've ever done. That's why I think this is such a great draft class for the Steelers.
Yeah, I'm right with you. When you look at the athleticism of this class across the board, it stands out. Broderick Jones wasn't just big and with long arms who could play the spot at tackle. He was also extremely athletic. He could move. He had a really good 40-yard dash. He was and you look at that and and I think it speaks to that. Joey Porter Jr. wasn't the fastest, but he was also very strong. He had one of the best bench press rep counts in the draft class. Keeanu Benton, very, very good numbers. Darnell Washington, one of the best graded tight ends as far as athleticisms in the NFL draft history. And when I look at that, I'm like, man, that is absolutely part of the emphasis here, right? Like we're looking at a Steelers team or Steelers draft class, that address that. And just to emphasize that, here's a collection of the relative athletic scores of every Steelers draft pick here.
Glad you brought this up because I was going to mention this if you didn't.
Absolutely. Kent Lee Platt, by the way, follow him at MathBomb on Twitter, does the relative athletic scores that puts it into a 10.0 to 0.0 calculation of how athletic people are, comparing all of their stats to every other person that's ever played their position and gone into the combine or done their pro days. And look at across the board here. Broderick Jones, a 9.58. Joey Porter Jr., a 9.71. Keeanu Benton, an 8.91. Darnell Washington, 9.88. Nick Herbig, the lowest at 7.75. Still not terrible. But then Corey Trice Jr., the first seventh round pick, a 9.65. And even Spencer Anderson, the last seventh round pick, an offensive lineman, a 9.37. All of these guys grading as some of the most athletic picks in the draft class, not only this year, but relative to guys that have played their positions over the years. And to me, Alan, when I look at this, I see, man, there's an emphasis to get tough athletic guys in the building and then frame them to what you need them to do in a specific scheme.
Yeah, and if you take Nick Herbig and you run him as a linebacker instead of an edge rusher, he moves from a 7.75 to an 8.07. So, I mean, look, they said they're going to use him at edge right now. We'll see. To me, I think, one, I think he's probably better off as a linebacker, but two, also the Steelers use their edge rushers a little differently than most teams. TJ and Alex Highsmith are standing up a whole lot compared to some teams' edge rushers. So he's a little bit better fit for them than the position in general. But I just think this is it. Like, this is exactly what the Steelers want. They want the best athletes. They want the best personalities, which are hard for us to judge from the outside. But I love what I've heard and from what I've seen on tape of this group of guys. Joey Porter, Corey Trice, super physical press man corners. Broderick Jones, a guy, really a butt kicker in the run game. Darnell Washington is, man, just maybe the most fun tight end I've seen in a while in terms of blocking guys and moving guys down the field. So, there's just so much to like from this group physically, and I think it clearly shows the focus of the organization. And I think it's a sound one. I think if you look back to, and you mentioned this on the final word, if you look back to the great Steeler teams, I think this is how they were built. I think this is the fundamental this is, to me, the fundamental piece of Steelers football is having great athletes that are tough and physical and can beat you up a little bit. And I think that's where this draft is headed.
I think so too, and I think it also emphasizes the identity that Mike Tomlin and the Steelers have been moving towards, being, again, a physical running team that can run the ball down your throat but can also make plays through the air, and a defense that beats you up, doesn't allow you to run the ball, but it still also gets after the quarterback. They just also needed some tough guys in the secondary. They have some, but Joey Porter Jr. looks like he could be another, and who knows, maybe so can Corey Trice Jr. as well. Lots of stuff to emphasize, but I want to look more at this offensive line with you, Alan, because I think that's the big emphasis, of course, with the first round pick that they traded up to get in Broderick Jones. We'll talk about that in just a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. But first, before we do any of that, I want to talk to you guys about our great sponsors, Built Bar, the #1 protein bar in America. If you're looking for a delicious treat but don't want all the fat and the calories, this is where Built Bar is for you. Built Bar gives you so many different flavors to choose from, whether it's churro, whether it's peanut butter, whether it's double chocolate, coconut almond, so many different things you could try. But it doesn't matter. They are all covered in 100% real chocolate around the Built Bar. And they're coming with all those flavors. They only pack 130 calories. They only pack 4 grams of sugar, but somehow they fit 17 grams of protein into every Built Bar. This is how you get your gains without any of the junk that you get normally when you're snacking on something. And you don't need to wait around to get a box anymore either. For years, we told you to go to Built.com and order some that will be delivered to your house. And you still can if you want. But if you wanted one just going into the store, if you go to your local Walmart or your Sam's Club, you could pick up yourself some Built Bars right out the box. That's right. Head to your Walmart today and head to the pharmacy section. You can pick up 4 bar boxes of flavors like cookies and cream and double chocolate and coconut puffs, as well as Sam's Club, where you can pick up 13 bar boxes with flavors like brownie batter and churro. All available right there. Go to Built.com or go to your local Walmart and Sam's Club and try Built Bars. That you'll trust me, you'll thank me later, because Built Bars are the best protein bars in America. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're here with Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com. Alan, let's talk about the Broderick Jones pick. Now, we both ranked our offensive tackles last week heading into the draft. You put Broderick Jones, I believe, as your third. I put him as my first. You had Paris Johnson as your first, and he was the first tackle off the board. The Cardinals traded up to the 6th spot to get him there. and making him the first off the board. But then Darnell Wright was the second tackle off the board. The Bears took him at 10th overall, where they traded down for. And then Peter Skoronski soon went right after that to the Titans, which put the Steelers in the position that you and I predicted would be very possible just last week on the show heading into the draft, and that the Patriots were the 14th pick. They were maybe looking to trade there, and the Jets were next up. And the Jets, according to all reports, had every intention of taking one of those top tackles, and with Broderick Jones being the last one, they were going to take him. And the Steelers made the move, and instead of even giving up the third-round pick or doing a pick swap, they just gave up the fourth-round pick, which they would later recoup with the Darnell Washington trade of trading down to 93 from 80 and getting a fourth-round pick back. But when you look at adding Broderick Jones, was this the primary objective of the Steelers, and did they accomplish it, at least on paper, in the NFL draft?
I mean, I think the primary objective is just to get the most good players that you can use as you can, and I think that's why getting Broderick Jones was so important. Look, it's not like Dan Moore is just so bad that any tackle was going to come in and make some kind of upgrade to the Steelers. They needed to get a high pedigree, high profile pick if they were going to make an upgrade at left tackle. And, by the time pick 11 rolled around that first round, there was one of those guys left, and it was Broderick Jones. Now, they're in the same situation at cornerback, but the difference was a much deeper class at corner. And also, while those tackles were going maybe a little bit ahead of where we expected, certainly in the case of Darnell Jones, the corners were falling down the board. No one thought that Christian Gonzalez would be available at 10, let alone him still being there at 14 and eventually going at 17. And then you saw Joey Porter, a guy that we all thought was going to be there for the Steelers at 17, end up being there for them at 32. So they just played the draft board exactly the way they needed to. The corners were falling, the tackles weren't. Jones was the last really good one available. They had to go up ahead of the Jets to get him, and they did that. And so, look, I don't know that maybe you put those first 10 picks in a bingo hopper and pull them out in a different order. Maybe this isn't the right plan for the Steelers, but it was the right plan for the Steelers with this board. And, man, I think the way that everything fell in behind that, look, they took a little bit of a risk going up. They weren't sure they'd be able to trade back down later. They weren't sure they'd get good enough quality with those day 2 picks to make this one stand up. But then, everything falls into perfect place after that. I said this the other day, look, if you had told me coming into the draft that they were going to get Porter, Benton, Washington, and Herbig with their first 4 picks, I'd have been like, all right, not bad. And that was picks 2 through 5 instead, with Broderick Jones as the cherry on top. What an awesome draft. But yeah, I mean, I think the trade up was necessary, and I think it really made everything else fall into place perfectly for him.
I think so too. Let's talk about how he fits into the Steelers offensive line. Now, you and I both know how Mike Tomlin operates. They're going to come into training camp, and he's not going to be a starter, and everyone's going to be tripping out when they see the first reps happening. Oh my God, why isn't Broderick Jones running with the first team? Is he a bust? We know it's coming, so be prepared. Months later,
bust. Biggest bust.
They're gonna call it bust. This is terrible before they even put pads on. And when they put pads on, he's gonna be that. But that's just how Mike Tomlin challenges all these guys. Kenny Pickett wasn't a starter even in the first games of the Steelers.
Third string.
He was third string to start last year.
Broderick Jones will not be third string.
No.
Mark my words on that one.
He'll be right behind Dan Moore Jr. on the left side. But Najee Harris, when he came into training camp, we all knew he was going to be the starter by the end of training camp. But when he came in to start, he was technically running with the second team. And then that quickly changed after like a week. But Broderick Jones is going to be, I think, that guy for the Steelers. But when I look at that, I think what would be the pace that we look at here? How soon do you think that he takes that spot off of Dan Moore Jr.? And how does that work into the Steelers' plans at offensive line? Because they do have Chooks on the right. Dan Moore is a guy that has 2 years of starting experience. And then we'll get to the other interior spots. But how does that work for them?
Well, I mean, I would assume that we're just going to see Dan Moore starting out with Broderick Jones behind him. I touched on this in the final word. There's some work to do with Broderick Jones. It's not like he's this fully constructed prospect. Right. Like, there's development there. And, offensive linemen, any really linemen, they take time to develop, even really good ones. I've written a lot about this offseason about Cam Hayward. 2 years he was a backup. Now, I don't expect that from Broderick Jones. Cam Hayward was playing behind better players. He was drafted a lot later in the first round. But it is not some sort of like slam dunk thing that he's absolutely the starter day one. It will depend on how fast he gets up to speed. He's going to have an opportunity to come in here, rookie mini camp starting in a week and a half, and really set the tone for where he wants to be this season. But it's really about how quickly he can pick up the offense and start to work on some of those things that are, necessary corrections and improvements that he's got to make. I do think he'll be an improvement on Dan Moore, and I do expect that he'll be the starter for most of the season. But is that preseason game one? Is that week one? Is it something like we saw Kenny Pickett last year where it's, first quarter of the season? I think it's probably too soon to tell. But, it doesn't matter at the end of the day as long as he becomes the player that he was projected to be and the Steelers believe he can be. I'm not sure that people should get twisted if it's not when they think it should be.
Now, with the way that he fits in with the rest of this offensive line, we're assuming Isaac Seumalo is going to start at left guard, Mason Cole at center, James Daniels at right guard, and then Chooks at right tackle. So how he fits in with this group, is this a group that you could see developing into maybe a top 10 offensive line at some point this season, or at least, protecting Kenny Pickett, making sure that he's not taking, disastrous hits like he did last year, and making the run game more effective for the Steelers offense?
I think the run game is the place where we'll see the biggest impact. I thought we saw some development from that unit as the season went on. Like if we were just, even if they brought back the same five starters, I would think that we would see better run blocking in 2023 than 2022 because they got so much better as 2022 went on. Then you bring in Isaac Seumalo, very good run blocker at left guard. And it's the thing that Broderick Jones is the most advanced with right now. As we're putting him out there today, he's going to be a better run blocker than he's a pass blocker. He'll have to bring up those pass blocking skills to get to the point where he's truly, like a starting caliber left tackle. But I would expect to see the big difference in the run game right away. We'll see how things go in pass protection. They should be better. I don't know that they'll be top 10 in that field, but I think they'll be better. But I expect that could be a pretty good run blocking unit even early in the season, sort of regardless of who plays at left tackle, but especially if it's Jones, because I think he brings an edge in that area. And I think the idea of putting him with Seumalo really could give them a left side that they could run behind that they haven't felt good about really in quite a long time.
I mean, when you think about it, even when the Steelers' offensive line was dominant and a top 10 unit, and maybe even the best unit at times during the 2010s, the left side wasn't the strong side. It was, Pouncey at center, DeCastro at right, and then Marcus Gilbert at right tackle when I felt this line was at its strongest. Ramon Foster, very strong dude, as was Alejandro Villanueva, but they weren't the stars of the line. But now you have a situation.
And they were kind of like a one good pass protector, one good run blocker, sort of shoved together. They didn't have that like, oh my God, the Steelers' left side is just this freight train to run behind like I think they could have with this group.
Right. And I think that's where we're looking at what could be the difference here is that they're not only, athletic, they're not only talented, but they can be the group that grinds you out. Like we saw towards the end of the season last year, even with the Steelers offensive line that didn't have Seumalo and didn't have Broderick Jones, they didn't have a first round pick on the line at all. And they were starting to bully opponents. You go back to that Panthers game where they were just running the ball down their throats. You go back to the Ravens game where they were finding ways to just keep drives alive. The Raiders game as well. You looked at some of the things that they did towards the end of the year. There was progress. And now you're going to be looking at Pat Meyer, who made that happen with that group. And now he's going to get more weapons or more tools with this group. It does make me think, maybe not a top 10 offensive line, but if they're in the middle to upper teens, that's still a very big development that could really balance this team out.
Yeah, and it was the big thing that was missing from the offense. I mean, if you look at the skill position players on that offense, young, but I mean, really talented, right? First round pick in Kenny Pickett, a high second round pick in George Pickens, a high second round pick in Pat Freiermuth, a first round pick in Najee Harris, Deontay Johnson, obviously extremely talented. Like this is a group that that we had high expectations for as an offense, and I think everyone felt like the offensive line was the missing link that was holding that group back. Now there's really not any excuses. They have the personnel to go out there and be a pretty good offense, and I think the pressure's on Matt Canada a little bit. He's got the personnel to do it now. He's got to find a way to make it happen at a higher level than he did in 2022.
I want to talk about that later this week. I want to do a whole show about the pressure that is on Matt Canada. So we'll address that with a leading topic another day. But I want to get to talk to you about how this draft class compares to some other teams that had their draft class, and because there were a few teams that performed that did really well, at least again according to the draft process and the rankings that we were all seeing and putting out ourselves. We'll talk about that and where the Steelers rank among other NFL teams here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm Chris Carter. He's Alan Saunders. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're here with Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com. Alan, the Steelers, I was wondering how they'd be received nationally. I know locally we were all kind of like, whoa, this is going a lot better than we anticipated for them. But then I started to check nationally. Everyone from Daniel Jeremiah to Mel Kiper, Jeremy Fowler, a lot of people were saying, man, the Steelers did the doggone thing here. Where do you think that this ranks among this year's draft classes that most impress you? I know a lot of people are going to say the Eagles. Some people might say the Seahawks. But, those are teams that had multiple first-round picks, and the Steelers hanging with teams like that sounds like a pretty good thing.
Yeah, I think if you want to look at who got the best players, it's probably not the Steelers because, like you said, just the amount of draft capital. But as far as who got the best value for their picks, hard time. I mean, look, the Eagles did a really good job.
They did.
Howie Roseman has been my vote for GM of the Year 2 years in a row. It's probably in the lead to get it a third year in a row. Man, they're good, and they don't miss every single time. I hear the little draft music, and you look up, and it's like, oh, it's the Eagles, the player I absolutely loved. Great, but. Man, I think the Steelers are right there. To me, I think they were the top two teams in terms of there is not a pick for the Steelers until you get all the way down to Spencer Anderson in the 7th round where anyone was like anything other than, oh, it's a great pick, good player, great fit, should have gone earlier. Like that was the whole every time they went. One of the best drafts I can remember from an evaluating it as it was happening standpoint. One of the best drafts I can remember the Steelers having. Just awesome. The Eagles to me are right there with them. Probably got better players due to their picks being stacked at the top and having that top 10 pick to get Jalen Carter. But man, I mean, I don't think anybody else was in that same category for me as what those two did.
I feel you on that. I did like the Seahawks draft. They also had 2 first-round picks, and they got Devin Witherspoon and Jackson Smith-Njigba, both the best I thought at corner and wide receiver, 2 premier positions. But again, comparing the value, what they did in the 2nd and 3rd rounds, I don't think was as much of an upside as the Steelers. And, I revealed my big board last week during the shows. And on my big board, I had each of the Steelers' first 4 picks, Broderick Jones, Joey Porter Jr., Keeanu Benton, and Darnell Washington, all ranking in my top 33 prospects overall. Now, not everybody is going to have that in their rankings, but at least as far as how things looked going into the draft process, that means to me that they got a bunch of guys who shouldn't have slipped down, but for whatever reason, and this happens every draft season. There's always positions that fall. There's always players that fall. There's other positions that are deemed more important. The run at quarterbacks, Will Levis going to the 2nd round, things like that. Wide receiver wasn't run on this year as early as it is. Normally you see a top 10 pick, and then there's a run in the teens, and it took until the 20s before there was 4 wide receivers picked in a row in the 1st round. But there's always differences. I just think that the Steelers, if you want to say that they were fortunate in how the board fell, I'd agree with you. But you prepare your crops for rain if you're a farmer, and the Steelers were ready for the rain. And Omar Khan and Mike Tomlin and Andy Weil, that front office, they took advantage of the board falling their way.
Yeah, you mentioned some other. I thought the Colts had a really nice draft, another team with a bunch of picks. But I really like what they did. Julius Brents, Josh Downs, Blake Freeland, Adetomiwa Adebaware, Darius Rush, Will Mallory, Jalen Jones way at the end. I like theirs. But yeah, I had every single Steelers player ahead of where they were drafted, except for Jones, who they traded up to get. I mean, that was the only one really, and Spencer Anderson, who wasn't even on my board, but whatever. Like, like that. Even like Trice, like I had Corey Trice as like a 3rd or 4th round pick. Like that is a really good draft for the Steelers. Just all the way around. But yeah, I mean, I think they had one of the best draft classes in terms of what they got for where they were picking. Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel you on that. I continue looking at the numbers on this draft class, and again the athleticism and where these guys are. You mentioned it, earlier. If they had come away with half of the guys that they got in the first 3 rounds, I would have considered this a successful class just by getting 2 guys that I targeted as top priorities, whether defensive line, offensive line, cornerback, or tight end with Darnell Washington, and specifically Darnell Washington. Like I wasn't, Dalton Kincaid, Michael Mayer, sure, they're top guys, but I wasn't as interested in like the Sam Laportas and the guys like that. I was interested in Darnell Washington because he just looked like a freak of an athlete who could be a mauler of a blocker that, yeah, he'll need some polish, but I think that his kind of polish in the NFL would be quick, and he could, even when he's not fully polished, he could be a serious weapon to them. And again, like all that value goes into this is going to be a very interesting run of rookie camp to mini camp to OTAs to and eventually training camp to see how do these guys fit in with the rest of the Steelers.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting the way they lined up the undrafted guys too. You could really very clearly see here's the position battle that they're creating with some of those guys too. A guy like Spencer Anderson, I think, and then they bring in Trevor Downing. He's like, oh, another interior lineman who's played 3 positions. Great. Like there's very clearly, okay, one of those guys is going to fight for a spot. They brought in they didn't get a running back. They brought in a running back and a kick returner and Bird from San Diego State. So the one place I really didn't think they kind of met what they were looking for is maybe off-ball linebacker, especially if they're dead set on making Nick Herbert an edge. They didn't really get anybody that can cover from that spot, and they didn't get one of those as an undrafted guy either. So maybe if there's like an XFL player or a hanging around free agent, to watch for, that's the one position. But I think they not only got really good value for all their positions, but they kind of checked almost every box too. Like I don't know what you could say other than that, like off-ball linebacker. I don't know what else you could say they were missing in this draft. And if they didn't get something, they went right to it. Like they didn't get a backup quarterback. There was kind of run on them. Grabbed Tanner Morgan as a priority free agent. Didn't get a running back. Got Bird. Like I don't know. Seems like it's such a good draft. There's almost not much to critic. Like I don't know what I can be critical of at this point. Like they did such a good job, and I'm not generally this like, yeah, everything's great, go Steelers, woo, like that. That's not me, but I got nothing bad to say about any of this process, really.
We're on the same page here. I agree. Off-ball linebacker. When Trenton Simpson was sitting there in the 3rd round, I know that they got Darnell Washington, but there was part of me that was like, and then he goes to the Ravens. You're like, that might come back.
The Ravens had a good draft too, by the way. Not as good as the Steelers, but I thought I liked a lot of their picks as well.
No, I agree. I mean, getting Zay Flowers at the first, I think him and Odell Beckham Jr. on top of signing Lamar Jackson to a long-term deal. Now it puts the pressure on. They got rid of Greg Roman. Their offense has to deliver this year as well. Or there's going to be some serious questions there about like if they'll ever get off the ground. With throwing the football and being a consistent offense here in the AFC North. But all in all, here, Alan, we look at this Steelers draft class, and we talked about them being bullies. We talked about being athletic. I think that there is now an emphasis on channeling all of that into finding an identity again on both sides of the ball. We know their identity on defense: stuff the run, get after the quarterback, have playmakers in the secondary who take advantage and create turnovers and up the turnover numbers moving forward. We saw that with last year. But now on offense, one thing that you and I talked about a lot, they didn't have an identity. And when they did have an identity, it was just they hold on to the ball, they convert 3rd downs, and they score at the last minute to kind of if the game is close. But you need an identity, whether it's making plays throughout the game, whether it's running the ball up the middle, down the sides, zone blocking, throwing deep, throwing short, play action, whatever it is, you need an identity. And I think with some of the players they added here and the added experience that we're going to see from Kenny Pickett, who was seen at a random concert drinking a beer, and apparently some people were upset that people might be upset about it. And I was just like, I didn't even see people who are mad at it, because that's actually pretty cool when your quarterback's just drinking a beer on stage and not getting into any trouble. But like, again, it's going to come down to those guys' developments on top of everything else that they've added.
The thing about Kenny was so funny to me is he was just on Ryan Clark's podcast, and they're sponsored by like a beer company, and they're all like, "Oh, we got to crack a beer at the beginning." And Kenny was like, "No, I'm training right now." Now this was like, I think they recorded it a few months ago, like back when he was down in Florida with the guys. So like, I guess it makes more sense. But I just thought the juxtaposition there was kind of funny. Kenny, drink all the beers you want. I don't care. It's friggin' off season. I'm gonna have one or several here directly. So like, do your thing. But man, hey, Kenny Pickett, talk about Matt Canada. There's some pressure on Kenny Pickett here too. There are fewer excuses around this offense, and now he'll still have that big one in his offensive coordinator. But I think he's got to play better too, and there should be better protection. There should be a better running game. He's got more weapons now. When you talk about adding Robinson and adding Washington, I think this comes with some more pressure to perform from the young Steelers quarterback as well.
Absolutely, pressure is going to be up, but pressure creates diamonds sometimes. We'll see if it does create diamonds for the Steelers. I think a lot of people making some diamond draft picks here. We'll see if all of that meshes together. When does Steelers rookie camp open? I haven't seen the dates for that yet.
I haven't seen the date, but it is not this week, but next week. Usually it runs like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then they don't actually do anything on Sunday. So I don't know. We'll see. But that usually, so I think it'll be, that's Friday, I think the 12th. So that's kind of what I put down on paper. I haven't seen an official announcement yet. But it is next. So there's 2 weekends. There's some of them will be this coming weekend, and some of them will be the following weekend. The Steelers are in that second group. But haven't seen a whole lot of announcements about invites yet. But they have 3 roster spots open, so figure somebody's going to make a contract out of that. And we've seen some guys get to the 53 from there in the last couple of years, so definitely something to keep your eye on.
Absolutely, we'll keep our eyes on that for sure, and how that plays out. But before then, we still got like about a week and a half or so before rookie camp opens. We start seeing how these guys work out at the Steelers facility. We'll be doing a lot more analysis on this draft class. We'll talk about Joey Porter Jr., how he fits in with the cornerbacks, Darnell Washington with tall personnel, Keeanu Benton, what he does for the defensive line. Lots of angles to cover here. Alan, we thank you for your contributions on today's topics here. Let people know you can find you, follow, and get more of your work.
Yeah, at @Saunders_PGH on Twitter. SteelersNow.com is where all the Steelers coverage is. Please go check it out at PGH Steelers Now on Twitter for the site. And we just have a boatload of draft coverage up there. Shout out my man Nick Faribault, graduated from Pitt.
Absolutely.
Today also. But me and Nick's coverage all there at SteelersNow.com. So go check it out.
Do check it out. They do a lot of great work. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette at post-gazette.com. And check me out here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, Monday through Friday, all week long, covering your Pittsburgh Steelers. And we thank you for everyone who listens to the podcast every day, because we're your team every day. And again, if you want to support the show, go on Apple Podcasts, rate us 5 stars with a positive comment. You do so at both at the same time. I'll give you a shout out at the end of the show. We're back tomorrow talking more Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.